No Time is Passing by Robert Aickman. Part 1. Truth to tell, Delbert Catlow was at first scarcely even surprised that he had not previously noticed the wide river behind the thick hedge at the bottom of their garden, let alone startled. By no means was this because he had been long oppressed by cares. Perhaps on the contrary, it was because everything had been so seraphically right and perfect. One does not turn aside from angels in order to count dustbins. They occupied the ground floor and basement of the 19th century house, solid and dependable as Angkor Wat, which it somewhat resembled, and, before that afternoon, Delbert had hardly entered the garden, first because always he had so many other things to do, many of them pleasant things, and second, because it had been crackly, cozy winter ever since they had moved in. One could hear and smell the holly burning everywhere. It was an evergreen hedge at the far end of the medium-sized lawn. Perhaps the occupants of the flats upstairs might have seen over it, but there had been no occupants of the flats upstairs, though one sometimes heard noises. The Cadlows supposed the flats upstairs were too expensive for occupants, and smiled ruefully at one another, and at most others. That day, Gregory Barfield, the most responsible partner at the office where Delbert worked, had departed at about midday for a friend's wedding in the country, after which everything had run swiftly into the sand, until all concerned yawned and upped, especially as the winter was so absolutely ideal. No longer droughty, but not yet too hot. No longer blustery, but not too still. No longer overcast, but not too glary. A day such as one finds only in England, and unlikely to recur that year or the year after. At that hour, Hesper was, of course, working still. She had been filling in at the town hall, of all places, until the birth of their child. She had reported that there was almost nothing to do, and a crowd to do it, but that it was often difficult, actually, to leave the building. As for the child, Delbert was not quite sure what the position was. Probably it would work out in the end. There were no fewer than 9 composition steps to the front door. Delbert sprang up them, lugged forth his bunch of keys, darted lightly through the house, and, for the first time he thought that year, unlocked the door on the other side. Quite possibly he was singing slightly, or certainly whistling. He saw the river at once. It was impossible not to see it. 11 alternative steps in highly ornamental iron descended to the lawn. The grass was in need of its first seasonal haircut. Hesper used to work purposefully in the garden from time to time, even in winter, but to Delbert she seemed nearly a stranger when she was among trugs and slugs. Assuredly, she looked different. He might never have embraced her had she always looked like that, so impersonal, so committed, so like others, so undemonstrative. Delbert went down and on in order to investigate. The ancient rust on the steps abraded the feet, even through shoes. The grass tinkled as the feet passed. These were not frail stems, lucky to be alive. These were the hardy and exclusive survivors. Delbert rose upon his toes, as he had been trained to do every day, again and again, in his echoing school gymnasium. He gazed across the top of the evergreen hedge. The long rainfall had turned the familiar dust on the thick leaves into something rather different. Delbert's suit was in danger. It was a fairly bleak scene, though on this quite perfect day beautiful, too, if one cared for things like that. On any other day, many people might look away. The water was unexpectedly low, especially as it was the end of a hard winter. No doubt the river was tidal, and at the moment the tide had turned again home. There was much mud, and not a seabird to scratch at it anywhere. Delbert, a male, was already becoming preoccupied with the working, practical details. All the same, there was nowadays very little open country east of Gunnersbury, and though the Thames figured considerably in the maps of the district, the Catlows did not dwell upon its brink. Delbert was certain of that. Of course he was. Nor was this river particularly like the Thames. as far as Delbert had inspected the Thames. There was no sign at all of what Eric de Marais used to call the Thames vernacular. There were few works of man to which a name could be put, that or any other. There was not even much litter, scarcely a transistor radio, living or dead. But there were steps, downwards, and at the bottom of them was a small blue boat with small green sculls. This time, the steps were of enduring Portland, not of precarious timber or of make-believe. They led from a gate in his garden that Delbert had not previously noticed, in the very far corner. Delbert sank upon his full 2 feet. He had learned to feel little pain at those times. He wondered if the gate were locked. He had no wish that Hesper be suddenly confronted with cadging, lusting beachcombers, their feet and shins red and bare beneath tattered, rolled-up sea trousers. The gate was a delicate affair, which would hardly have held back such characters in any case, and it opened widely at the first touch, so that Delbert was beyond it without having to make a decision. On this side, the evergreen hedge was smeared with mud up to its top, as if winter tides swept through it, and 6 or 7 feet over the Catlow's lawn, which could hardly have been the case, and assuredly had not been for the last 6 months. Or could it sometimes have happened when they had both been out at work? Delbert looked back over the gate at the windows in the 3 upper floors of the house. Could there be more dependable observers? At least no one was close enough to the glass to be visible from where he stood. The gate was designed to close itself, as if the fire officer had intervened. No matter, it could be reopened very easily indeed. Delbert had just learned that for himself. He descended this further flight of steps, looking carefully where he trod. Not until he had reached the bottom did he properly re-examine the whole landscape, or seascape, perhaps. For Delbert now felt doubts whether this water was properly to be described as a river at all. It looked saline and sullen. It was true that on his side of things were many of the familiar suburban landmarks, or Delbert supposed they were familiar. He had really spent little of his time staring at them. He had always had something better to do. On the other side were dark green trees, flat-topped and rather low. There was a certain amount of couch grass. There were black hulks, where ships of different kinds had been wrecked, whether by tempests or by failure to pay their way. Some were sprawled in the wet mud. Some were crumbling much further inshore. Beyond doubt, the spot had its own melancholy appeal. On the far side, there was no sign of human life in the present tense. Perhaps, for the moment, that added to the appeal. The land over there rose gently. Possibly beyond the low ridge, things were different. The boat at Delbert's feet looked charming and tempting. Her short painter was tied to a ring in the bottom, but one step. In his time, Delbert had come upon ferries that people were trusted to use with discretion and to look after on their own, though, in the nature of things, such accommodations must become rarer, as must, indeed, ferries of all kinds. Delbert peered at the name of the boat, painted upon the stern in slightly cramped letters. It appeared to be, "See for yourself." Delbert almost guffawed and looked at his watch. Unfortunately, his watch had stopped, as that particular watch often did, when brought to unexpected places, or otherwise disturbed in its ways. Delbert looked at the sun instead. At camp on the plain, he had been trained to assess time and place. He estimated that it would be an hour and a half before Hesper would be back. Even if he was not there, it would not matter, because Hesper could have little idea of what partner Gregory's absence had brought about. At that very moment, partner Gregory would be drawing on the bridal Bollinger, perhaps even rehearsing a gloriously facetious toast, tapping his feet the while, like Jack Buchanan, whom he often imitated from films, quite unconsciously. Delbert loved all boats, as he loved so many things. With at least 90 minutes for pure play, he could not be expected to hold back. He knew well how to handle oars and sculls. At school, he had risen to first reserve for the second 8. He and his associate had all but won a double sculling plate. All the same, as he embarked this time, he distinctly heard a voice, speaking for a moment, though not what the precise words were. In a general way, the silence was little less than heavenly, especially while so much else was heavenly. Very soon, the only sound at all was the chatter of the water. It was delightful, but unusually rapid, like the voice he had heard. Delbert realized that the current was running faster than he had supposed. Nothing could be plainer than that he must not allow himself to go with it, not, if possible, for a single yard. He must scull diligently against it, for as long as seemed worthwhile, or as directly as possible to the opposite shore. It was not, however, that the current was strong enough to cause the slightest actual alarm. Delbert had seen for himself, before setting out, that it was not. He could never have been as mistaken as that. For example, he was not concerned about any possibility of difficulty in returning to the steps and leaping ashore. Such trouble as there was related to his being unsuitably dressed for real exertion. If he were to land on the other shore, Wellingtons would be desirable, possibly high waiters. After all, the best thing might be simply to make a circuit of some kind, and then return sooner than he had originally planned. He set about pushing his way sturdily upstream, if that was the proper term of reference. The little shallop was pleasingly spick and span, a delectable miniature of the true boat-builder's craft. But Delbert began to wonder if the sculls might not split apart in his hands, or the whole construction suddenly disintegrate in the swirl. It had been driven into him that courage was always the very first thing in life, not least during periods of recreation, and of course he had found it true. One trouble was that there were so often others to think of, his mother and stepfather, who had long been a second father to him, Hesper, the elusive unborn child, the chaps who depended on him at work, many of them less well placed than he was. As Delbert reflected in this way, taking very short strokes, feathering industriously, pressing his city shoes against the tiny adjustable stretcher, a flat gray mist, like a soiled lace curtain, passed before the sun, though only for moments, and even then by no means blotting out the placid disk. Delbert, who in the nature of sculling was looking backward towards his home, saw that a uniformed lad stood between the delicate gate, waving a telegraphic envelope. Now was the real test, and well Delbert knew it. In his conspicuous clothes, he had to bring the almost uncontrollable cockleshell to a smooth and perfect landing at one single, special spot. Furthermore, he had first to turn the said cockleshell in the swift and stubborn stream, and then to stern the landfall with eyes in the back of his head. While not exposing himself to jocosity and to ensuing hostility, he had to accomplish all swiftly, lest the boy filter away. Hesper and he often sent one another telegrams, because both of them were much of the time away from a telephone. The local post office had instructions, for what they amounted to put telegrams through the letterbox if no one answered either bell or knocker. Other things commonly eventuated, as now. Part 2. As it happened, Delbert both came in and stepped out perfectly. Nothing so far that day had given him greater pleasure. He even stood there and waved to the boy to come down. But the boy shook his head and dangled the orange envelope over the gate. Delbert ascended the stone steps with dignity and took it from him. It was never worth complaining about anything, even jocularly, or referring to anyone's short measure or lack of enterprise, and in any case the boy seemed particularly eager to be on his way. He was a shrimpish boy, with overlong arms, and his face was pale as a mushroom. Delbert read the telegram. "Delayed by inspection audit. Sorry, darling. Back by 9. Hesper." It was unusual, but not unprecedented. The boy was almost back at the dank passage alongside the house. To communicate, Delbert had to shout, "What's the name of this river?" "Dunno," The boy sounded as if he had little wish to know, or to speak either, let alone to bellow, but he did stop for a moment, possibly from surprise or shock. Or is it a creek? The boy said nothing. Perhaps he might not know what a creek was. Might think it was some kind of Chinaman. Or a straits? At which word the boy looked very scared. Too scared even to say something rude or obscene, and scampered down the passage as if from the copper. Delbert could not think how he had come to ask such a question, to use such a term. He shoved the telegram into his pocket and stared out once more at the equivocal prospect. He would be without defined occupation for the next 5.5 hours, longer if Hesper's estimate were insufficient. The crowd at the town hall were at once the servants and the masters of democracy. Despite all the protocol, their behavior was inevitably unpredictable, even to themselves. Delbert saw that on the far side of the water, a figure of some kind was waving, much as the telegraph boy had just done, but more lustily. For the moment, from the top of the steps, which he was beginning to think of as his, Delbert could make out mainly a mass of unusually bright yellow hair. The sun, no longer curtained, glinted on it, and at the same time dazzled Delbert. He began once more to descend, for no particular reason, except possibly that the figure was summoning him. He saw, too, that a strip of matting now descended the muddy opposite slope from the low ridge. It was as if the figure had unrolled a dun carpet behind it, somewhat after the manner of a snail. Back at the water's edge, Delbert realized something else. The number of steps had diminished by one, and the little boat was floating more freely to its painter. Somewhere the tide had turned. Possibly the mist before the sun had related to this. At this level, one could see more than hair across the flood. A squat, square, but probably masculine figure dwelt beneath the yellow and was beckoning to Delbert personally and urgently. When Delbert did not at once respond, but merely stood staring, the figure began to make vivid movements, indicating the need for Delbert to re-embark and scull over. Delbert seemed to be confronted with a competent natural mime, but he wondered why. If the man needed his company so badly, he did not make himself the passage. Why he had no visible vessel in which to do so, or to go anywhere else. Delbert himself was already settling down as an established boat owner. One day he might hope to own something larger and more spectacular than this almost childish little pram. Delbert had no wish to be disobliging, so he stepped gingerly aboard and settled to the crossing. Different reflexes were required from the last occasion, but Delbert deemed that he handled himself well. First the telegraph boy, now the yellow-haired person. Perhaps Delbert shaped up best when under strong observation. Within the exigencies of the sculling process across a willful flood, Delbert could see no more of the man on the far side until at the very last moment he was confronted with the entirety of him. The man had seized the painter from far off. Everyone seemed to have very long arms that afternoon, young and old. The man dragged in the dory a little too roughly. Delbert simply did not know the exact and best name for the tiny ship, but as if habituated to such ploys. In a second, his hand was outstretched to Delbert, big and hard, as the largest of crabs. "Petrovan," he said. His voice was unexpectedly high. His face was flat, his eyes were flat. His general coloration was rubicund or umber. His hair was as the flames round the sun. His height was as restricted as had been thought, his breadth as boundless. Moreover, the name was known. "Catlow." Delbert took the hand with such circumspection as could be applied. "We're neighbors," said the man. "I suppose so," said Delbert, trying to smile. The man had been smiling most broadly from the first. "So we may as well be neighborly," said the man, gleaming at Delbert's entirety, as if waiting instantly to stamp hard upon the slightest exception taken. "As far as all this water between us permits," said Delbert, establishing a small advance, and now himself smiling quite noticeably. "When it's there," said the man. "Come and have a drink, a smoke. A yarn. A drink would be very pleasant, said Delbert. Very well, then, said the man, and led the way. The wide strip of matting ran upwards among the curious, flat-topped trees and the black wrecks. It gave little sign of having been trodden upon. Delbert was convinced that it really had been unrolled while he had been back in his garden for a few moments. The man's feet were bare in any case, and his trousers rolled to the knees. Here it was just such ship of passage as Delbert had feared might invade. Moreover, there was an extreme inconsistency between the present appearance of the two of them. As he ascended, Delbert became aware of shapes standing motionless beneath the trees. The shapes were black, too. They frightened Delbert. Since returning to his home that afternoon, he had not been exactly frightened, not until now. Before he had reached the ridge, he had come to realize that under each tree was at least one of these shapes. Perhaps they guarded the path from the shore. Perhaps they were not to be found further inland, if one might put it like that. Perhaps they lived in the wrecks and had crept out for some warmth. The long-armed man with the yellow hair said nothing as they climbed, nor did he once look back encouragingly, nor, for that matter, did he glance from side to side, verifying the black residence. But Delbert knew perfectly well who he was, or who he was claiming to be. They were probably impostors, notoriety seekers and attention demanders. The real Petrovan, so to speak, had often received attention in the newspapers. He was good copy. The items about Petrovan and his kind were of no particular interest to Delbert. He could not remember even discussing them with Hesper. He did not know that He did know that Petrovan refused to appear on television. Prominence was always given to that eccentricity. Petrovan claimed that television waves disintegrated the enduring soul. His face, therefore, was less familiar than many. What he said about the television seemed to be very likely, Delbert had always thought. But there, his concern had ended. Between the ridge stood a red hut. Beneath the ridge stood a red hut, square as Petrovan, if he it really was. The planks had been flushed again and again with ox blood. Thick grass rotted on the roof. Delbert passed his hand slowly over his head, as he often did, confirming that his hair was still smooth and even silky. And beyond the hut was nothing at all, nothing but a muddy waste extending to the sky, and, afar off, indistinguishable from it. The flat trees were confined to the slope up which Delbert had climbed, though there they had seemed to grow abundantly and uniformly. On this flat, muddy plain were only occasional trunks and stumps, struggling amid tangles of dead weeds. Nor beyond the ridge were there any of the wrecks. Presumably the ridge acted as a barrier even to the very highest tides, to those tides which must have engulfed the Catlows long when they had not been there, and so much else, no doubt. Delbert looked back. He could see his home quite plainly, and the other semi-familiar suburban landmarks. He was almost surprised that they were still there. All the same, he could also see that the tide was now racing ahead. So small a boat as his should probably be withdrawn from the water. Temporarily, but soon. He could see it bobbing and flopping. "I gotta go back," he cried. "Well, I still can't." "There's no need," said Petrovan in his high voice, but still without turning, or even looking over his shoulder. He had nearly reached the hut. On this side of the ridge, the mud looked viscous and bottomless. Perhaps the ridge was man-made, a vast sea-wall. Perhaps men of old had directed Colossi in the building of it. Perhaps it was an ultimate precinct. "Where am I?" cried Delbert to the man's unturning back. "What is this place?" "My humble little burrow," squeaked Petrovan. "I'm sorry it's not gaudier." He had opened the crimson door, gaudy enough for any 6 ordinary folk. "But where are we?" persisted Delbert. "I've never been here before." "You live here," squeaked Petrovan, and began to giggle. "But all this open space," began Delbert interrogatively. However, he was inside the red hut, whatever the thought. Petrovan was piling bottles onto a table, 3 or 4 at a time in each of his hands. The oblong wooden table, very thick and solid, was marked with geometrical shapes, some table game that had not before come Delbert's way. Certain of the pictures on the walls were impossible to look at, others were merely inexplicable. There were caged animals everywhere, all so strangely silent that Delbert could not at first make out whether they were animate or stuffed. The wooden floor was marked out, also. "What shall it be?" asked Petrovan. "You name it." Delbert tried to take in the numerous bottles, to discriminate. "Try this," said Petrovan. Delbert had not seen him pour it, but Petrovan was holding out a triangular glass on a polygonal stem. The fluid within was colorless, but clouded. Delbert supposed it to be ouzo. One is supposed in the West to like ouzo nowadays, even to select it. "What is it?" inquired Delbert, as affably as he could. "Ambrosia," said Petrovan. "Down with it." Delbert had realized that the smell was quite different from the smell of ouzo. This smell was as rare and heavenly as the day outside. The smell must have inebriated Delbert, or liberated him. He drank down the little draught as if upon doctor's orders, as if the doctor were present to watch him. "That's a remarkable drink," he cried. "What's it made of?" "Bee's wing, among other things. Moonstone, edelweiss." "Do you make it yourself?" "To the old recipe." "Where did you find that?" The truth was that Delbert would eagerly have accepted a refill, but Petrovan showed no sign of offering one. "In one of the old books," he said. "I forget which." There were many old books in the hut, in among the animals, and weird sketches. Petrovan himself was not drinking at all, despite the profusion. Delbert began to suspect that somehow the display of bottles, many of them entirely familiar, was fake. "Better sit down," said Petrovan, and again giggled shortly. Delbert had to admit that he was glad of the invitation. All the seats were solid wood, and all but one were backless. All but the one with the back bore deep marks on the seats. The one with the back was plain and worn as Charlemagne's throne. There seemed to be provision for more people than the hut could hold. Still, the inside of the hut seemed far larger than the outside had suggested. Delbert saw that there were even doors, but perhaps they merely led to cupboards, or perhaps they provided for apartments that had not yet been added and very likely never would be. Such situations were common enough, after all. "I still don't know where this is," said Delbert. "Where is anywhere?" replied Petrovan. "What do the words mean? What answer can be given? You are on the far side. It is always strange on the far side, to begin with." "This place feels like an island." "This place is an island," said Petrovan. "I live on an island, though I don't recommend you walk all the way around it, because you'll never come back." From somewhere he picked up a grapefruit, tore it apart, and sinking his reddy brown face into the 2 shards, began to suck riotously. Delbert looked at him. "I think I know who you are," he said. The matter had to be raised sooner or later. Delbert was not prepared to be taken for a ninny, or an unread ignoramus. "Think you know?" gurgled Petrovan. Of course you know. Everyone knows." But over Petrovan's shoulder, Delbert had noticed something. In one of the wired cages was an animal that no one thought possible. It was a very small white sphinx, and its 2 vague eyes were gazing at him. "Have an apple," squeaked Petrovan, and pitched it at him. "Or would you prefer a very big pear?" Delbert slowly shook his head. "Let's gossip," said Petrovan. "I'll have to start, I see. Eat your apple. I'll ask you a series of questions. First question, what do you make of me? Decide for yourself. Ignore what is written." Delbert looked at the floor, covered with intersecting trapezia and spirals. More of them, he fancied, than when just now he had entered. "I imagine it is a hypnosis you go in for. I don't know much about that." As he spoke, the apple seemed to throb in his hands. Petrovan threw away the sucked-out grapefruit skin and began to eat a long banana, skin and all. The skin was bright as his hair. Delbert simply could not see where all this fruit was coming from. He had not seen where the bottles had come from. It was these things that had given him his clue. Perhaps cross-headings in the various news items also, absorbed subliminally. Second question. What do you think is going to happen to you? In a few minutes, I am leaving it crossing the water before it rises much further. Third question. What do you suppose the world is doing? Going to the dogs, mainly? Really, he did absolutely need another drink. Perhaps an addiction had been established. That seemed quite likely. But possibly it was only this sudden warmer weather. Delbert tried to concentrate his mind upon what he had previously drunk, anything at all. But he simply could not remember. No mere apple could quench such a thirst. In any case, he had mislaid the apple. Fourth question. What were you doing that you noticed so little in all the time you've lived here? We've only just arrived. I'm quite newly married. I have my career to think of. My wife may be expecting a baby. Last question. Would you rather be living or dead? Oh, living. I've had a topping life so far. I mean to go on while the luck lasts. Do you feel ready for bed? Asked Petrovan. I thought you'd asked your last question. To that, Petrovan said nothing. Perhaps Delbert had caught the demon by its tail. That is said only to happen inadvertently. Nonetheless, it had to be admitted that the day seemed to have grown very overcast, especially as, properly speaking, it was but tea time, pleasant in the office, and pleasanter still in the home. Spacious though the interior of Petrovan's hut was, the windows were few, small, and irregular. Jeweled lights had come on here and there inside the hut, without Delbert noticing the actual moment, but it had been such an adorable day, while it lasted. One was bound to regret it. There's nothing to worry about. There's nothing to worry about, said Petrovan, chortling. It's only the sunset. But it was not a proper sunset at all. It was much more as if the heaviest of sea mists had descended upon the land. Delbert could see that mist was even seeping into the hut. The little lights were as markers in the mouth of a huge dark harbor, or in the mouth of Behemoth himself. Busy people have no time for twilight, remarked Petrovan. It's the time you're most likely to see a ghost, rejoined Delbert. He had remembered that ever since his infant school, a private kindergarten, no subsequent place like it. Busy people have no time for ghosts, asserted Petrovan. It was upon this surprising observation that Delbert acquired an insight. The normal and average idea was that the press took every opportunity to exaggerate frenziedly. The truth was that in any matter of consequence, the press was bound to act with great caution, to diminish, to belittle, to concede. Else the press would go unread by normal and average people. Petrovan appeared not to be laying into a whole green pineapple, hair, spikes, and all, but the interior of the hut had assumed the blackness of the Empyrean, with just a few misty, twinkling, and multicolored stars. Release me. Delbert had purposed a commanding shout. He had achieved but a foggy mutter. Sleep for you now, said Petrovan. One could hear his fangs rending through the fibrous flesh. In the other room, there was no mist at all, though a single stout candle provided the only direct light. Painted upon the walls were dim, glistening angels with wings and mantles. From his recollections of the outside, Delbert could not see how there could be another room of this shape at all. But it hardly mattered. He had been very far from sure that he really wished what he had demanded. Freedom might be all very well for Petrovan and his kind. A rare kind. My life! Exclaimed Delbert, theatrically, though throatily. But he was looking with longing at the mysterious couch. No time is passing, squeaked Petrovan. In that case, would you please blow out the candle? You'll need a light of some kind. This tempted Delbert to boldness. I'd like another drink, One is enough before sleep. Am I going to die? Of course not. Shall I see my home again? In a matter of minutes. The candle's like a headlight. It's like the Dungeness lighthouse. All through this and his sister's childhood, Delbert's family had stayed each year at an hotel in Hythe. He and Hesper still went there whenever they could, despite the enormously increased costs. It was a really good place, especially for young children, when one was one. "It'll calm down when you're alone with it," said Petrovan. Part 3. Petrovan had been wrong about one thing, even if about nothing else. He had twice spoken of sleep, and so far Delbert had failed to sleep at all. Winds from all quarters were converging upon the hut. Every now and then, objects from the night sky fell heavily on the earthy, grassy roof. The candlelight was now small, as Petrovan had promised, and startlingly distant. Light at the end of the tunnel, Delbert could not help thinking. The mantled and aerial angels gleamed ambiguously on all sides. The protection proffered by sexless angels can be terrifying. Nonetheless, Delbert no longer knew when or whether he was frightened or not. Physically, he was most comfortable. As was to be expected, he had never before known so cozy a crib. Hesper! Oh, Hesper and their lovely lives together, lovely even when they were apart. Now Delbert was not only longing for another wonderful elixir, he would have been grateful for a drink of pure water. Perhaps there was no acceptable source on Petrovan's island. Delbert was as parched as the man in the last sequence of Erich von Stroheim's film, but he suspected that multiform thirst was the explanation of his managing to remain awake. From the far dream world, beyond the tiny light of the candle, a figure was gliding, totally imprecise, except that it was carrying a flat bowl. The angels stirred slightly as the figure passed, like shapes in the Wayang. Delbert knew that the bowl contained water and stretched forth both his arms, so considerably shorter than Petrovan's arms, or even the arms of the boy from the telegraph office. The figure was standing by Delbert's couch. Delbert prepared to take the receptacle. He was not used to drinking from a wide bowl, so first he looked. There was a picture in the water. At the bottom of it, on the surface of the bowl itself, a moving picture in a half-light. Delbert saw Gregory Barfield, the most responsible partner at the office, enjoying the wedding, which of course must be going on at that moment. There was no doubt about the locality. Gregory was togged out as when Delbert had last seen him, and nuptial accessories were discernible on all sides, though not the white birds and beflowered groom, Siamese twins at such a time. At the moment of viewing, Gregory Barfield, with his familiar grin, was holding the hand of another guest, a lady, of course, and in fact, the lady was Hesper. She had never said a word to Delbert about going to any wedding, and what about the wording of her telegram? Delbert realized that he had not checked the office of transmission. He was so perfectly accustomed to Hesper's telegrams, almost always from the one office, a sub-department of the town hall itself. Delbert forgot to drink, even to attempt to drink, and the figure glided on, without his noticing. However, he reached a decision, quickly and without difficulty. He had just seen his own thoughts, an occurrence not remarkable in such a place as this, and two things uppermost in his mind had become blended. There is no certainty in anything, only likelihood, and if we lose hold of likelihood, we never cease worrying. As soon as he was comparatively settled in his mind, Delbert felt thirstier than ever. First came the thirst for water, then was likely to return the craving for Petrovan's fluid specialty. To end that, a protracted, costly, and unpleasant professional cure might be necessary. Perhaps the recipe had not come from an old book at all. People often made statements of that kind, figments of conversation, reasonable responses. Delbert realized that a second figure was approaching. He sat right up, as far as was possible, on so delectable a divan. This time, however thirsty he might be, Delbert still looked first. It was a bigger bowl, but the picture filled it. He saw the garden side of his home, but his home was surrounded by figures whom he took to be a new kind of police. All the windows were tightly shut, and the structure exceedingly disconsolate. Rather curiously, there was no crowd of inquisitive, hostile people outside the cordon. No one seemed to care what was happening, to be curious. Delbert addressed the figure bearing the bowl. "What is it? What is happening?" The figure replied in the gentlest, sweetest voice, though the words were few. "You are wanted by the enforcement." "What do they wish to enforce?" But the figure had glided on. Perhaps one sentence only was possible, or was permitted. Delbert saw that the mantled angels, one and all, had altogether ceased to shine. He was alone with the one faint candle in the unbounded dark, though still comfortable enough in the muscular sense, a consideration never by a wise man to be disregarded. There was too little light for the third figure to be seen at all, or possibly Delbert was too distraught. "I'm not looking. I'm not drinking." He was aware that the figure continued to stand there, nonetheless. He was too paralyzed positively to turn his back. He perceived that the water in this third bowl was flecked with darting internal lights, as from very tiny phosphorescent tiddlers. The figure went on standing. The lights in the bowl became more razory all the time, hurting Delbert's eyes. He tightened his eyelids, as when in earlier days his hideous grandmother had entered the room, but now it seemed to make no difference. The lambent fish were swimming through the intermediate void. Not in the bowl at all, but in the black, though flecky air before him, Delbert saw himself. It is always alarming to see oneself, and said by many to be a presage of one's death, but what Delbert saw was himself in some public security office, surrounded by democratic interrogators, even though the actual instruments of their task were omitted from the picture, presumably left by request in the next room, the first of the rooms with blood on the floor, ceiling, and walls, like the walls of this hut. The sharp lights had gone, the bowl had gone, the figure had gone. Ultimately, Delbert clutched at comfort. Among the interrogators, none of them in uniform, had been, most unmistakably, Gregory Barfield, the responsible one, which alone suggested, in all probability, that confusion and bald nightmares reigned still. But Gregory's apparition was not, as it happened, alone as evidence. Delbert had identified the room, also. It was a room at the town hall, adjacent, actually, to the room in which Hesper mostly worked. Part 4. Call it a day, if you wish. Petrovan was standing there. He had come silently in from behind Delbert's head. He was now wearing a gray, knee-length garment of ancient Hellenic pattern. His legs and huge feet remained bare. It struck Delbert that Petrovan's legs were as short as his arms were long. "Call it tomorrow, if you prefer," continued Petrovan. "What time is it, really?" Delbert inquired feebly. "Look at your watch. I see you carry one." "My watch has stopped. It stopped long ago." "It's not stopped." Delbert looked up, then held the watch to his right ear, already the better one. The watch was ticking frenziedly. Delbert had never known it make so much din. Of course Petrovan had heard it. The whole oddly shaped room could hear it. Delbert looked at the dial. The two hands crudely underlined the fact that the time was 4 or 5 minutes later than the time at which they had recently ceased to move. This particular watch was always behaving peculiarly, always saying less than it should. "Do you want to go?" asked Petrovan. He expelled a prune stone onto the floor and kicked it neatly into a corner with his bare toes. Then he inserted another prune. He appeared to have a stock of them in his garment, even though ancient Hellenic dress included no pockets. That was something else Delbert had learned at one school or another. To his own surprise, Delbert could not at once answer. "It's entirely for you to say," observed Petrovan, always open-handed. "What if I remain?" inquired Delbert in a low voice. He had been having trouble with his voice for some time. "You can have anything you wish, pretty well." "But only an imitation of it? A facsimile?" Petrovan giggled. "You would hardly want the reality of it." Delbert continued to reflect. He needed to be entirely fair to all parties. "Why me?" he asked. "Why do you make this offer to me?" "We're neighbors." Petrovan put in 2 prunes simultaneously. "At least 2. Besides," he added, "not everyone is fit to serve." That really settled it. Delbert was upon his feet in a jiffy. Those words had set the old school bell tinkling and clanging like a fire alarm. "I wasn't being serious," Delbert said, hoping to score in a tiny way against a conservationalist so absurdly overweaponed. "I have my wife to think of. She must come first." Petrovan's merriment might have split the roof timbers and brought down the earth on their 2 heads. "You reminded me of Nietzsche, who had no wife," he gasped out. "At one time, he was always speaking like that about women. I can hear him now. It was before he took the pox, of course, and went off his clever little balance. Do you know that Nietzsche could never keep his tiny hands off?" Delbert shook his head. He had scarcely heard of Nietzsche or of any other deep Teutonic thinker. "Sweet cream cakes at the conditoré. The floppier and fluffier and featherier the better. You know what Nietzsche said about women in the end? Or rather, about woman?" "It's not my line of country," replied Delbert firmly. "I'm not interested in such things. I prefer to take life exactly as it comes. I'm going to trot off and catch my boat." He noted again, to his surprise, that he could not now manage even a conventional thank you. How glad he was that, since he had to lie down, he had done so fully dressed. He was quite tired of all funny business. He could consult his usual doctor, and, in all the other ways, too, resume his proper beliefs and optimism. "I told you that you were free to choose," was all Petrovan had to say. He inserted more prunes. "Everyone is free to choose." In his heart, Delbert doubted that last, but Petrovan's line of talk was as much beyond him as he had always assumed it would be. It was impossible not to succumb at the outset, but enduring attitudes and values soon made a comeback, as they always do. In confirmation whereof, Delbert saw that the sun was again shining brightly, though not too brightly. "I'm going to skip," he said. Petrovan spat once more. "Do you know what this Soloviev told me?" Really, Delbert felt the old fellow with the hair was becoming a mere bore, quoting another worthy continental he had met somewhere, or said he had. If he were to be honest, Delbert would have had to admit that he did not know how exactly he had emerged from the hut. It was something else that didn't seem to matter much. Now he was scrambling in his city suit up the less familiar side of the low ridge. At the top, he was pleased to note that the long strip of matting was still in position, though now smeared from side to side with mud, as if whole damp legions had marched up and down it again and again, or been marched. In many cases, the matting was now positively driven into the basic mud beneath it and rapidly merging. As far as Delbert could see while he ran, all the black shapes were still in position under the umbrella trees, watching and guarding, or else merely sunbathing. Fortunately, Delbert had often run on matting. It had been put down when the grass tracks had become quagmires, in which immature ankles and knees twisted and tangled like spaghetti. Each year, it had very soon become too soppy and deliquescent to use. Delbert could hear Petrovan pelting down the course behind him, though upon what rationale, it would be difficult to say. Delbert had experience enough neither to slacken nor to quicken, and in no time he had leapt lightly aboard, and cast skillfully off. Only when his hands were on the sculls and the blades and the briny did he look back. By then, he had no choice in the nature of the sculling process. Petrovan was dancing about like a Numidian, with both long arms waving in the air and his garment shivering preposterously. "Come again whenever you like. Think again whenever you wish." "Farewell, old cock." Apparently, Petrovan was more like a cockatoo, but to have called him that would have been ruder than Delbert proposed. Part 5. But all was again familiar, insofar as a hideous screaming main road with no one thing to be said for it, even as a mere utility, with nothing to distinguish it from any other hideous screaming main road, could be described as familiar. For a moment, Delbert looked around at the structures and creations and graffiti on this side of things, all familiar enough too, though never precisely inspected as individual exhibits, thank God. Delbert strolled through the traffic, recovering his breath and full composure. A thicket of weeds and junk, all more truly and personally familiar, lay at the bottom of his garden, as he had always known it, or at least believed. He plunged in. The thicket had once itself been a garden, but now the squatters were in and out of the homestead, now one, now the other. Everyone remarked upon how well they behaved, how considerate they were. The homestead belonged to a very old lady, who was said still to hang out precariously in one of the rooms, entirely dependent upon the kindness of strangers. Seldom, as will have been gathered, did Delbert make use of this particular plunging route, but the present seemed hardly the moment for squeamishness. He found that the delicately ornamental gate at the corner of the evergreen hedge had been bound with a brand-new padlock. He sprang over the obstacle. On the other side of his lawn, by the house, stood a police officer, but one only, and in accepted garb. "Who are you?" asked the police officer, stepping towards him. "I live here," said Delbert. "Can you prove that?" inquired the police officer. "Very easily," said Delbert, producing his credit card, his driving license, an insurance certificate, and 3 fully addressed envelopes from foreign parts. "I have bad news for you," said the police officer. "You've had housebreakers." Delbert gazed upwards. The whole building looked smashed to pieces and wan to a degree. The weather was again going off, too. "Do you mean we've been burgled?" "Housebroken. We don't think they've taken very much. Often they don't these days. Probably just pop records and things they think too personal. They don't like personal things. Sharing would be the word for all. That's what they say. Better go in and see." Delbert went down to the dark passage without a word. Another police officer was on guard by the front door. His was a doubly significant service, because the front door had been blown apart, as in wartime. This officer saluted Delbert gravely. There could be no question of his being other than a normal, respectful constable. Inside, it was as much as had been predicted. The authorities acquire experience of these cases and can often analyze at a glance. Here, everything possible had been wrecked or despoiled, but little removed beyond what the first officer had said. The main positive demonstration was that 2 separate people had done business upon 2 separate areas of the new carpet in the living room. 2 separate people there really must have been. 2 at the minimum. Also, something suggestive had taken place on, in, around, and even beneath Hesper's once pretty bed. Among the main things not taken were 7 demands, applications, and interrogations from public bodies. They were piled neatly in the hall, probably by the police. One had come from Gateshead, one from Galashiels, one from somewhere in Wales that not merely began with a G, but was almost all G's. Job creative, in every case. Delbert sat down immediately and opened them in succession, breathing heavily the while. There seemed to be no other correspondence, but perhaps other correspondence had been deemed suitable for censorship, at present informal. Oh, here was a new wedding invitation for Hesper and Delbert Catlow and Jimmy, whoever he might be. Delbert went to the sink and donned glass after glass of water, as if it had been the end of the house match. The police officers waited without, cleaving to protocol. Survivors. Delbert waited within. In the end, another of Petroven's special foggy sunsets made itself felt, even over here. Not that anything had so far taken place that directly lent support to those three terrifying visions. If a last ditch were ever to come into sight, consequence would be called upon. There are coincidences everywhere, and likelihood is often linked with them. Hesper showed up little more than an hour later than her telegram had promised. She was wearing a silk dress, which Delbert did not think he had seen before. Whether or not he had seen it in the vision, he simply could not remember. Probably he had never noticed. Few men really take heed of what women are wearing at any particular moment, least of all their own women. By that hour, the police officers were long departed. "We'll have to go now, sir. You'll be perfectly all right." Happily, many of the lights still worked, and even some of the other gadgets. Everything could have been far worse. Furthermore, Hesper explained herself at once. "Sorry to be so late, darling. The assistant borough treasurer's daughter threw a birthday party." Hesper then shrank away from Delbert's arms. She stared around. "Why? Whatever's happened?" She seemed terribly shaken, even more, Delbert thought for a moment, than the admittedly grim situation quite warranted. But in the end, she pulled herself together wonderfully, and was effective and efficient in every relevant direction. Whatever could be done at that rather late hour, she immediately did, and that which had to be left till the morrow, she faultlessly planned. Delbert was a cipher by comparison, but not for one moment did she allow him to feel this. Tomorrow is always another day. Take it or leave it.